In this section, we're going to talk about the mailbox directory mail storage format, which is the default storage format implemented by Postfix. We're going to show you how to alter the default storage location for mailbox compliant messages, and we'll show you how messages are normally routed when using the mbox format. Now, the mailbox or mbox format is the traditional Unix format for storing messages. It actually appends messages to one file in a sequential fashion, and the file needs to be handled properly for locking, and as a result can run into problems with respect to competition for locking of the file. In subsequent sections, we're going to show you how mail directory files or maildir's files work, where messages are organized in a directory structure with one file per message being the default representation. Let's log in as the user Linux CBT SUSE1, and we'll take a look at the current setup. Again, the default configuration for Postfix is to spool or deliver messages that are destined for the local system into the location var spool mail and into the user's mailbox. Let's take a look here. We'll SU in and we'll navigate into var spool mail, and this is the default directory for spooling messages. By default, each Unix and or Linux user account maintains or is represented by one file entry in the var spool mail location. There's one for the user Dean, Linux CBT SUSE1, and for the user root. When you set up subsequent users on the system, they'll eventually get an object, a file object, or have a file object in var spool mail as a result of receiving new messages. It gets created by the MTA when the user receives a message. Usually the file is readable by the owner of the mailbox, in this case the user Dean, and also of course readable by the user root, which all files are throughout the Linux file system. So the MTA spools messages into the user's mailbox file, which is basically a text file which contains each message appended or concatenated. So all messages are concatenated into one file. Again, there are issues of performance and locking that are related to mailbox or mbox format, but it is the default Unix and Linux format, and most, if not all, MTAs support it, and it's Postfix default implementation. So when you send a message, the mbox file grows. Let's examine that. We'll launch mutt. We'll compose a new message and send it to the user Dean, since we're looking at Dean's mailbox. Testing mbox routing. We'll save the changes and send the message out. Now let's quit the mail user agent mutt and relist the directory. Notice that Dean's mailbox has grown from 0 bytes with an older date and time stamp to 696 bytes with a new date and time stamp which reflects the current time. This file again is a text file. If you do a file against the mailbox, which is now populated, it comes back as ASCII mail. It's a text file. So you can examine it if you have the proper permissions. Generally, mailbox files should be restricted to the owner of the mailbox and, of course, to the root user on the system. A less of the user mailbox file for Dean will show the contents of the mailbox file. Each message begins with a line that looks like the following: from, followed by a space, whereas subsequent lines actually are terminated. The first field is terminated with a colon. The very first line of an mbox formatted message looks just like what you see here. It indicates who the message is from, separated by a space between the from and the actual sender, and this is the envelope sender of the message, followed by a date and time stamp. And the rest of the contents you see beneath that is the actual message. Let's compose a new message. We'll send it to the user Dean again. Test 2. It won't contain a body. We'll execute Y to send it, and now let's relist the directory, and you'll see that the Dean or Dean's mailbox has grown from 696 to 1378 bytes. Now let's examine Dean's mailbox file again to see how the messages are delimited. Again, the first message is here, and the second, there are some spaces after, including the user agent and anything the user agent populates in the message, followed by the subsequent message, which begins with a known line or a known format, an expected format, which indicates to the mail user agent, in our case the one that we've been using is MUT, that this is a separate message. So this is message number 2, this is message number 1. So here are two messages in mbox format. Again, mbox is subject to performance issues when you scale it, and subject to read-write locking issues. Only one application can read and write to the file at the same time. What we want to show you is how to actually change the default location where postfix spools the messages into mbox format. The default is to place it again into var spool mail, because this is compatible with other MTAs such as sendmail, and most of the mail retrieval technologies such as IMAT and POP3 based servers know to search either var spool mail or var mail / of course the user's mailbox, which is usually indicated by the unique user ID or the unique username on the system. But what if you wanted to spool these messages still in mbox format directly to the user's home directory rather than to the var spool mail location, since theoretically messages end up in the user's home directory anyway as a result of using the mail user agent, such as MUT. MUT, for example, upon exit asks if you'd like to send the message or reroute read messages into the user's home directory. Let's Control-Shift-N to open a new window to show you what we mean. We'll launch MUT. This user Linux CBT SUSE1 has no messages, and from root shell window we'll launch MUT, send a message to Linux CBT SUSE1. Test. And now that message has been sent to Linux CBT SUSE1's mailbox. Now here's the message. We can read the message, interact with the message. Currently MUT is actually reading the message from var spool mail. We know that because there is a variable called mail which points to the default directory, including the mbox file name, for retrieving the mailbox content. So having said that, let's attempt to exit MUT to show you, and if you notice it says, or it prompts us for whether or not we should move the messages into the user's home directory into a file called mbox. This is a default of the mail user agent MUT. Other mail user agents behave in a similar fashion, and this can be toggled. If we select no, the message remains in var spool mail. So back to shell number 1, LSL of the subdirectory shows that Linux CBT SUSE1's directory is no longer 0 bytes. The message wasn't actually moved from the var spool location. Great. So in the user Linux CBT SUSE1's directory, there's a file called mbox, which if we choose to move the messages will cause a concatenation from var spool mail into the user home's or the user's home directory mbox file. Now back to what I said before regarding what directives the mail user agent uses for retrieving messages. Simply execute a set grep for the mail variable, and you'll see that the mail variable points to a directory called var spool mail Linux CBT SUSE1. This variable gets defined when the user logs in by a series of files that are processed by the shell, which will alter, of course. So by default, the mail user agent consults the mail variable, which points to the exact location of the mailbox file, which is in var spool mail and the user's mailbox name. If this were changed to some other user's mailbox name, it would fail because the user Linux CBT SUSE1 simply doesn't have permissions to read the other user's mailbox. So it's all based on Linux file system permissions with respect to restricting what users can and cannot see. But again, why go through the step of moving the messages into var spool mail? You may have a mail architecture that would be much easier to manage, or logically easier to manage, if you simply spool the messages directly into the user's home directory. In order to do so, simply make a few changes in the postfix directory in the main.cf file. Let's navigate to etc postfix, and we'll modify the main.cf file. There's a directive in here called home_mailbox. By default, these two directives, and they're two different types of directives. One is for mailbox format, the other is for maildir or maildir, which we'll look at later on, are both commented out with the default set to home_mailbox equal mailbox. The default is actually set to var spool mail and the user's name. That's what the default is. However, we can uncomment this option and reload postfix, and this will cause delivery to the user's home directory for subsequent messages. Let's just simply place a comment here. We'll simply echo or specify modified by Dean and today's date. So this has been updated. Let's save the changes, and we'll execute a reload of postfix. And now messages will be delivered to the user's home directory. Now for the user Linux CBT SUSE1, there is no file called mailbox, capital mailbox. Let's attempt to generate a message from root's shell to the user Linux CBT SUSE1. We'll delete this message which is in the inbox. We'll compose a new message and send it to the user Linux CBT SUSE1. Testing reroute of mbox files, we should say. We'll send this message, and now from the shell, we'll purge the message that's currently or was in our inbox. From the shell, let's navigate to var spool mail, and as you can see, Linux CBT SUSE1's box was last updated at 1420, so it hasn't grown. However, in shell number 2, if we relist the directory, you'll see that there's a new file called mailbox. This file was created by the postfix daemon, which routes the messages. So this file, like the mbox file or the individual user mbox files that are stored in var spool mail, is of the type mail, and it is ASCII text. Simply execute a type against mailbox, and not the mail directory but mailbox, and you'll see that the file is actually, and let's go back here, file mailbox, and as you can see it's ASCII text. But there's one thing we need to change so that we read the proper mailbox. If we were to launch MUT in its current state, you'll see that there are no new messages, and in fact we can delete this message and quit MUT again. There are no new messages, and it's so because our current mail variable, which MUT relies upon, currently points to var spool mail and to the user's mailbox name. Again, a set grep mail will echo that MUT will consult the mail variable and attempt to open a mailbox located in var spool mail named after the currently logged in user, Linux CBT SUSE1. So simply update this variable using the export command. So export mail is equal to our home directory and a file called mailbox. And now, when we rerun the set command, mail is actually pointing to our home directory. Now let's launch MUT, and there's the new message. Okay, and it actually says it's okay, it's testing of the reroute of mailbox file, and so on. Now this isn't a permanent change, or nor a global change. If you want to make this change globally, then you should change the system configuration files. Let's go back to the root shell, and you can make the change on a SUSE Enterprise installation in the etc directory. There's a file called bash.bashrc. You can make changes to this file since it's sourced towards the end of the main profile file. There's actually a file called profile which bash reads, but SUSE's documentation prefers that we not make changes to the profile file. In fact, it prefers that we make changes to a profile.local file, but the profile.local file gets sourced before bash.bashrc. So a few ways that you can implement this. You can make the directive on a per user, or make the change on a per user basis. In shell number 2, you could make the change for the user Linux CBT SUSE1 to one of the bash files, the hidden bash files, bashrc, or you can change it globally if you intend to reroute all messages like we've just done to the user's home directory. So on a global scale, simply modify the bash if you're running SUSE Enterprise. If not, consult your distribution's documentation for where for what order the files are actually sourced. And towards the end of this document, we'll just add a comment which says added by Dino for home mailbox support. We'll also indicate the date, and we'll simply specify that we'd like to export the mail variable and set it equal to the user's home directory / the location or the name of the file that postfix will make the mail available in, which is called mailbox. And this is all we need to do. Now once this is done, we'll close shell number 2. The reason behind this is so that we can source the bash startup files again. It's an easy way to source the files. We'll now open a new shell, and now when we actually set grep mail, you'll see that mail is actually pointing to home Linux CBT SUSE 1 mailbox, which now means if we launch mutt, we're reading our local mailbox. And again, from shell number 1, we can launch a mutt instance, and we'll send a message. As you can see, this mutt instance is reading var mail root because we haven't updated the variables for root by closing the session and reinitializing the session. We'll send a message to Linux CBT SUSE 1 testing reroute of mbox, and we can add any body or whatever we'd like. Let's send the message. It's now gone, and in shell number 2, where we're logged in as Linux CBT SUSE 1, we'll simply move the arrow key up. Now before we do, notice below it says that the location of the mailbox is ~/mailbox, which implies tilde expands actually to the user's home directory in the bash shell, followed by the mailbox file. So let's move the arrow key, and there's the file, new mail in this mailbox. And by the way, mutt can actually open many mailbox files, providing you actually have permissions to do so. But great, we've actually rerouted delivery of messages from var spool mail to the user's home directory. Now this also implies that if you were to install a mail retrieval application such as Courier IMAP or Cirrus or University of Washington IMAP-D and so on, you'll need to indicate to those mail retrieval utilities the location of the mbox file and or mail dir file if supported, or a directory if supported. Great, so you now know how to move the mailbox location, which may or may not be important in your environment, depending on how you intend to implement postfix in your MTA. Again, the default for compatibility's sake is to route messages into var spool mail, but we've made changes that will now impact the system-wide delivery for postfix. So we can now ignore these file entries that we see here because postfix will deliver the messages directly to the user's home directory into a file called mailbox, and that's capital mailbox. So any mail user agent that's configured locally from a shell account or from the console should be configured to check the user's home directory in a file called mailbox, because postfix has altered the delivery. And in many environments this is something that's desirable rather than going through var spool mail. Again, this is for compatibility with other MTAs such as sendmail. Now some mail user agents actually query /var/mail. On a SUSE enterprise system, and certainly with other distributions, you'll see that var mail is simply a symbolic link to var spool mail. So either or, it leads to var spool mail. And we've just altered things to go to the home directory. And we've also made the changes on a global scale. So in the next section, what we're going to do is actually take a look at maildirs, or the newer Unix standard for routing mails into a directory structure rather than into one file, because as I've mentioned, there are locking issues as well as performance issues related to the mbox format. Although it seems neat that you have all messages compiled or concatenated into one file. It makes it easy to transport it, but maildir offers superior scaling as well as no locking issues so that you can implement it across NFS shares and so on. So next we look at maildir.